We're really here today to talk about one other point in the system that we think is often underestimated, and that is hydrology, holding water in the landscape, how that creates small and large water cycles, and what that really does ultimately for our ability to have food security and produce nutritious food. As the mighty Tim Benton has just discussed, I don't know if anyone was over there earlier, but Professor Tim Benton of Chatham House, amongst other things, he's very clear at describing the fragility of the global food system. 5 major ports around the world where the majority of the commodities are traded, all of which are under direct or indirect issue from extreme weather events or war. Now, farming sustainably and building soil and building life within our soils is a wonderful way of restoring weather. And going back to us at Pelican Ag, we are regenerative food and farming investors. We're trying to bring more of the LP community into this space in the same way that a lot of the farmers and producers here are trying to bring more of their cohort into this space. It's vital, apart from anything else, to give oxygen to early stage companies so that they can begin to be a keystone to unlocking some of the regenerative scale that we're looking for. Now, Henry Dimbleby talks about the need to translate some of these complex processes as you would to a 12-year-old child so they can understand it. As Tim Benton does that with global food systems, Walter Jehne, who we're lucky to have with us remotely today, recorded, is exactly that. David Attenborough for hydrology, what restoring our water systems looks like and what ultimately it can do as a solution to climate, to really restore it. With that, I'm going to hand over. Simon, do you want to add something?
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful intro. So this is Walter. He's been at this for an awfully long period of time. This is about a 14 minute video, I think. Walter's going to set the stage. There's going to be a lot of deep concepts that he's going to rattle through, and then we're going to try and unpack some of them.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Groundswell UK. We wish you were with you, but obviously we're down here, down under. But basically we're there in spirit, electronically, but also our whole global network of innovative, regenerative people involved with regenerating the Earth's soil carbon sponge are 300% behind you. But basically, while they've been working for the last decade in this area quite actively, we're now hitting a point where what you're doing is actually critical to humanity globally. Because climate extremes are actually happening now, well before predicted by the models. And these climate extremes, be they storms, floods, droughts, desertification, wildfires, are actually collapsing the very biosystems we need for our survival and future. And so we're now in a situation where, in a sense, unless we fix this problem in the next 10 years, humanity could be really facing crises of food, habitat, stability because of these climate extremes. And the only way we can fix them is as nature does. And we're very lucky because nature actually has these solutions. But only way we can fix them is through hydrology, through the rebuilding, the buffering and resilience of biosystems that their natural hydrology provides. And it was basically hydrology that provides 95% of the heat dynamics of the blue planet. It's hydrology that enabled life to evolve. It's an hydrology that enabled life on land to expand from 420 million years ago across the whole land surface. And it's hydrology that regulates the productivity and resilience of our habitats. And hydrology does that, or is enabled to do that, because of groundswell, because of the formation of the Earth's soil carbon sponge. That process of photosynthesis and microbial biosequestration, whereby solar energy and CO2 are fixed and converted into initially biomass and then stable soil carbon through petagenesis to create the sponge, to create those well-structured soils that can infiltrate, retain, and make available water and sustain the longevity of green growth. And we now need to use those same regenerative petagenesis soil forming processes to rebuild the hydrology and thereby the resilience of this landscape. It's actually very profound because this carbon fixation process, petagenesis, is the only known process in the universe that actually reverses entropy, that takes solar energy and instead of dissipating it, actually fixes it as stable soil carbon. And in that stable soil carbon, we can build natural capital, and it's a natural capital in those soils, which is what you're effectively building through Groundswell. You know, the resilience, the buffering, the bioproductivity, the nutrient cycling, the water holding capacity, the rootability of those soils. So critically important. It's also important in now cooling the planet. As I said, we've got extremes and now we've got to naturally, safely, rapidly cool the planet. And we can do that through hydrology and petagenesis. Basically, transpiration takes water molecules, evaporates them, and dissipates them back into the atmosphere. But to do that, it needs to take heat energy to turn it from a liquid to a gas. That heat energy comes from the surface and cools the surface. And that transpiration latent heat flux basically takes 24% of the incident solar radiation back out to space. And we need to restore and enhance that to naturally safely cool regions and habitats. But we can only do that through rebuilding the sponge, the hydrology, because that transpiration needs water that has to come from the soils. So again, the point of agency of that transpiration cooling is rebuilding our soils. Once that water has gone into the atmosphere, it forms clouds, and those clouds can reflect up to 33% of the incident solar radiation directly back out to space, further cooling the planet. Okay, but again, those clouds can only form if we have soils and hydrology, if we've basically had the groundswell, the earth soil carbon sponge to sustain and supply those soils. It gets better than that though. Basically, we have to actually address the greenhouse effect. And we've seen that in the last 50 years focused on reducing carbon emissions. But in fact, the greenhouse effect isn't just about carbon gas concentrations. It's driven by the amount of re-radiation coming off the land surface and then the percentage of that re-radiation absorbed by greenhouse gas molecules, including CO2, which is about 11% of the gas effect. But we can actually turn down the greenhouse rapidly and practically by reducing the amount of re-radiation coming from the earth. And we do that by decreasing the temperature of those soil surfaces, because basically the amount of radiation is governed by the fourth power of the temperature of those surfaces in degrees Kelvin. If we have hydrated green surfaces, they rarely get above 20 degrees centigrade. Contrastingly, if we have dry, arid, exposed surfaces absorbing solar energy, they often get up to 70 degrees centigrade. So the amount of heat being re-radiated is massively different. And if we can keep surfaces green and protected and covered, we can massively turn down the re-radiation and thereby the greenhouse effect, because greenhouse gases can't absorb energy that hasn't been re-radiated in the first place. So here we are. We have a practical, direct agency on reducing, turning down the greenhouse effect to cool regions and the planet by keeping landscapes hydrated, cool. And we can do this within a matter of weeks by simply maintaining those surfaces. But it's not easy. As I said before, corrected, there's 14 billion hectares of land on this planet. 5 billion hectares, or 40% of that, we have desertified, degraded through our land management practices over the last 8,000 years. So that land, that degraded land, is re-radiating massive amounts of energy. So we've got to basically regenerate some of that land rapidly, practically, to reduce that re-radiation. And the answer is yes, we can, but we only have about a decade to do it. So you and Groundswell and your practical direct action, grassroots action, is now critical to cooling the planet, to rebuild the buffers, to rebuild the resilience, and using your earth, soil, carbon sponge and groundswell to rebuild the hydrology, which is what naturally enables that to happen. Governments for 50 years have fixated on CO2 and greenhouse, but all we get is talk, talk, talk. And it is now far too late to try and address climate change in these extremes through any response in the carbon accounting area. So we are really it. We need to actually do the regeneration grassroots now, everywhere. Fortunately, industry, who recognize that they're actually very exposed and at risk from these degradation and these collapses, are now recognizing, hey, we've got to get on board. How do we invest in practical direct action to build buffering, resilience, cooling? And so this relationship of corporate leaders and grassroots community have an enormous role to play in regenerating the Earth's carbon sponge, groundswell, and in that way, safely cooling the future and the planet. So we wish you well and look forward to interacting further with you and look forward to your discussions, Chris, Simon, the whole team, and obviously providing any of the science behind these processes. But look, let's just get out and do it because it's up to us. So thank you very much and all the best.
Thank you very much, Walter. So there's a lot to unpack there. We're not going to cover all of it. Chris and I will be available for Q&A in a bit, maybe in about 15 minutes. But let's get into some of this. And hopefully there's a little bit more clarity here in Walter's thesis, which is not just his thesis, by the way. Walter is part of a whole community of scientists who I think have been largely sidelined, and tragically, over the last 30 years. Often these scientists are independently funded. They've been shunned by reputable academic institutions for saying controversial things like water is important. So let's get into it. And yeah, maybe I just leave the first message. If it wasn't clear in Walter's presentation, from our perspective at Pelican Ag, the farmer and the land steward is the hero and really is our salvation. It's the landowners that are going to move the needle. It's not going to be anyone else. So let's get into some of that. Whether you think that agriculture started, 10,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago, you can find different archaeological records. It's still an emerging field as to when we really started to cultivate the land in different parts of the world. But in any case, we've really fucked up an awful lot of the planet, and it isn't just a problem that started with chemical agriculture in the Industrial Revolution. And much as I love organic farming, and I sort of grew up in a community of people passionate about organics and biodynamics, our ancestors have been unwittingly engaging in a process of ecological destruction. We've just simply been speeding up the process. But as Walter was touching on with the soil carbon sponge, this relationship between carbon and water is actually critical to understand. Carbon is extremely hydrophilic in the soils. I think one particle of carbon holds roughly 4 parts of water. So there's an exponential relationship between the availability of water in the landscape in its relationship with carbon. So carbon is a tool. It's not a super accurate proxy of soil health by any means, as many of you will know, but it is a useful starting point. Also, as Walter touched on, the context here is absolutely critical. We've all been slightly brainwashed. And it was Charles Keeling in 1970, speaking to Jimmy Carter and other world leaders at the time, bringing climate science to the mainstream and the urgency of the problems that we were facing, who sort of reluctantly accepted that trying to explain the complexity of physics and soil biology and all of these other scientific fields to policymakers was just far too difficult, and recommended that they just focus on greenhouse gas emissions. So here we are, all this time later, largely as a result of reductive thinking. We all know that this is a multifaceted, interwoven problem, and it really can only be tackled as a whole. All of these things are separate in the minds of human beings, but in the reality of our biosystems, they're all one and the same. They're indistinguishable factors that need to be weighed in the balance in our decision making, and that's the key insight of the most brilliant regenerative farmers and thinkers around the world, and I would like us to hold on to that. So yes, to come back to another key point of Walter's, yes, we can remove CO2 out of the atmosphere. Yes, we can change our energy systems. But if you take Walter and the scientists that he works with at face value, even if we were to remove all of industrial emissions out of the atmosphere, if we were to achieve net zero, we still haven't fundamentally addressed the re-radiation effects, the bare ground, the lack of biodiversity, and the fact that our soils are screwed and they're not absorbing water, and we're rapidly losing water from our landscapes. So, you know, we could do that. We could spend the next 10 years just focusing on carbon, but we're just going to be passing on an even more gigantic problem, and probably a more terrifying problem for future generations. So this is the good news. On the last day of Groundswell, we can do it. There's nothing stopping us from doing it. And it's extremely achievable. We're only out by 1%. Bear in mind that a square metre of healthy, verdant wood pasture that's been heavily rested, that had some animals eat it and poo on it 100 days ago, or whatever, you know, our best case North Star in our own particular farms, that land is re-radiating 85 watts per square metre per day. We're out by 3 watts per metre squared per day. So even the regen light stuff, I'd say, is worth doing. You know, even if you're just beginning to nudge in this direction, it all helps. You're a large company buying from large farmers, but you can still do things that are more focused on soil health, that are more focused on these cooling dynamics. It's all good. But also, so is best practice, and reminding everyone else what best practice is. So as many of you know, whether you study permaculture, holistic management, natural sequence farming, organics, biodynamics, in ecological terms, these are the 4 processes that we're harnessing. Some of us are good at focusing on one or a number of these. Some of us try and manage all of these in our minds and in our decision making. And I've just listed a few fairly obvious management practices that may relate to the improvements of these individual ecosystem processes. But if we think about water cycles, it's a very powerful lens through which to understand the climate because of these cooling effects. This is actually from the AMP grazing research that Peter Bick talked about, I think, yesterday at 8:30. It's one case study. It's just one of the farms, so it's anecdotal. So take it at face value. But this is a farmer who's had the world-class advice from Dr. Alan Williams and Gabe Brown and has applied it consistently over a 4-year period. And as you can see, yes, there's a big uplift in soil organic matter, 3.5x. Yes, much healthier plants if you take plant bricks as an accurate proxy for the health of the sward. Great sort of changes in the forage species and the diversity of the sward, and a great economic impact there, assuming the farmer can still make a margin on that meat. Very, very powerful increase in stocking density. I think this was in Mississippi. Yeah, Mississippi cattle ranch. So bear in mind, fairly verdant, fairly predictable rainfall. So, you know, take that as you will. But look at that water impact. That's 6,000%. Now, what's the value of 6,000% to you as a farmer? You know, what does that do to plant biomass growth throughout the growing season? The longevity of green growth. What does that do to your grass growing, I don't know, 1 week or 2 weeks earlier in spring because you've woken up the soil biology, because there's healthy structure down there and there's a sponge, there's deep water in that landscape. What if you were to add trees into that landscape so that when the water level does decrease in summer, the trees are able to bring some of that water deep within the water table that you've been refilling? What's the value of that water to the water companies and the local people in your community that rely upon that water for everything? You know, this is important stuff. As you can see, we're very passionate about it. So going back a little bit, the process of pedogenesis, essentially the science behind soil formation on planet Earth, is a good thing to delve into, because it explains how the planet developed habitability. Because you take all of the excessive amounts of carbon dioxide and methane and others in the atmosphere, and essentially have converted it into biological systems within the soils, which have provided a medium and a habitat for plants and then animals to build off. Water in this system has an incredible ability to retain or release heat. So we'll come back to some of these processes. But if we were to touch on re-radiation, that temperature times temperature times temperature times temperature effect that Walter was referring to is called the Stefan-Boltzmann equation. I've got it down here in the little notes that covered healthy soil, roughly speaking 20 degrees Celsius. This is actual data from a farm on a hot summer's day with 30 degrees Celsius air temperature, but bare soil right next to it, let's say asphalt on a road, 60 degrees Celsius. So we've created human infrastructure that's warming the planet. None of that is factored into climate policy. So I don't know what the maths on that looks like, but we've created gigantic amounts of human infrastructure, which is essentially a radiator. And as Walter said, once that heat goes into the atmosphere, it then gets trapped in the greenhouse gases. So our CO2, our methane, etc., are exacerbating the issue. Healthy farmland is essentially, and healthy natural wildlands are operating as a gigantic refrigerator. That's the re-radiation effect. I don't know how easy it is to measure it on a farm. I'd imagine it's very complex. But it's not something that we're thinking about, I don't think. Effective rainfall. So as I touched on, that 6,000% increase is a measure of water infiltration rate in the land. Now, there are some companies out there and there's some consultants that are working with water companies to work out, well, what does that mean for, let's say, flood mitigation? Or what does that mean for the amount of water moving through a particular watercourse? But these are really important things that we need to start understanding. One thing would be useful to understand right now in our country is how much water, how many billions of gallons are we losing from the British landscape each year? Now, we have the perception that we still have that water because we have all of this rainfall in our autumn and our winter and our spring. But it's not entering our land, is it? It's sitting on our fields and it's flooding and it's rushing out to sea. So we're not capturing that water. So if the soil is degrading and we're continuing to build infrastructure in an ecologically inappropriate way, we are losing natural capital year on year through the loss of water in our landscapes. Equally, if we're farmers that are rehydrating our landscapes, you're building an enormous buffer against climate weather extremes that are coming down the track. So it's another sensible economic strategy. Evapotranspiration. So I think it's around 500 kilowatts of energy is required to essentially create one micro droplet of 1 million micro droplets. I think requires roughly 500 calories of energy, like a Snickers bar or something, large Snickers bar of energy, in order to be formed. That's a gigantic amount of heat transfer. As Walter touched on, 24% of incident solar radiation is generated by these water-driven effects of water evaporating off the landscape, forming clouds, and ultimately leading to precipitation. Cloud cover as well. High albedo clouds reflect a gigantic amount of heat back into the landscape. So these are all compounding effects that stack up on top of each other. They also lead to more regular rainfall patterns. So you can actually track this and look at this on satellite data. There's a number of people that we follow on LinkedIn, hydrologists that are focusing on this research. AlphaLow has some excellent research on this. I'm hoping that Alpha will take on the mantle of Walter, who, as you can probably tell, is not very well. And it would be great to get Alpha here next year to talk about some of these things in even more scientific detail. So yes, the cloud formation is super important, but the clouds form because the ground is healthy, the soil is healthy, the plants and animals are in the landscape acting in the way that they should be, following natural systems. But there's also bioprecipitation. So we both have fungal microbes as well as bacterial microbes in the soils of different genetics in different parts of the world that appear to have critically important symbiotic relationships with rainfall patterns. One of these fungal microbes is called Pseudomonas syringae, and it appears to drive snowfall events in northern and southern, in temperate climates at high altitude. You can do a test, as some students do when they study biology, where you can take supercooled water and you can drop a pipette, like a little droplet of this fungal microbe into supercooled water, and it instantly turns it into ice. And we still don't necessarily understand the fundamental physics of how this is taking place. But even in the Amazon, there are also people are looking at bacteria that travel through the stomatas of certain trees and seem to have a very, very predictable effect in coalescing water vapor, turning it into rain. So we have bacteria that have a relationship. They are spreading their genetics via an intricate relationship with the landscapes from which they've evolved. Of course, if you're degrading land and covering it in chemicals, you're essentially fundamentally disrupting the rainfall pattern in that particular area. You're destroying the local water cycle, essentially. Equally, if you're engaged in regeneration, you're repairing these processes. And if you're doing that, you should feel enormously proud of yourselves. This is some data from the Mississippi Ranch. You can't quite see the J-curve here, but it's appearing to look like an exponential process, i.e. there's a period at which, if you continue the sensible management, the practical management that's leading towards ecological health across the system, you start to build soil at depth rapidly from year 4. Of course, this is just one anecdote. In your context, it might take 10 or 20 years, but the important thing to understand is the formation of aggregation at depth appears to have some sort of exponential relationship. It's not a linear relationship that we might see in how soil organic matter gets deposited, let's say, in the first feet of the soil. Of course, you'll appreciate that you need deep-rooted plants, perennials, and trees to be able to create some of these effects. So just touching on these, I've sort of touched on many of these. Which ones have I not touched on? The photooxidization of methane. So healthy land creates hydroxyl ions, negatively charged oxygen-hydrogen molecules. These interact with water vapor that comes off the land and sunlight. And that chemical process breaks the methane down. That's the methane cycle. So in healthy systems, there is no methane loading as such. It's part of a healthy cycle. So a myopic focus on the burps of cows is really a cul-de-sac for policymakers, and we should really fight against it. It just doesn't stack up in the face of the scientific research. I've touched on the bioprecipitation. And yes, just touching on the bottom. So that infiltration of water, that dramatic improvement in water infiltration, that's the the measure of, let's say, inch per hour. Some of you might be doing it on your farms already. That infiltration leads to higher retention. So that water is now moving slowly through the soil profile, following gravity, whatever it interacts with, and percolates. Maybe it fills groundwater aquifers. Some of it, of course, a lot of it is going to end up in the riparian system. Now, if you're rebuilding the riparian system, like some of the people here, I was speaking to Ben McDonald earlier, who does very interesting things, re-wriggling rivers, working on farms. If you're slowing the water down in the landscape, that's another strategy of driving these cooling effects, and also building the water table in that riparian landscape. All of these things contribute towards water moving slowly through the landscape and driving these, let's call it, refrigerator effects at scale. Now, a little bit of a plug for the work that Chris and I are doing, the crusade that we're on. In venture capital land, there's this thing called climate tech, and within there's a whole class of investors globally that are investing in food and agriculture. Only 2% of notional climate finance goes to food and agriculture, and of that 2% of venture capital that's funding high-risk innovations that could potentially be contribute towards regeneration at scale, well, they're not going into techniques and strategies and tools and technologies that are tackling regeneration. I think they're largely going into strategies that are tackling the symptoms rather than the root causes of the problems, and that's a massive issue. Our cause is to try and channel venture capital in towards regeneration via technology that is designed and is appropriate for the needs of land stewards and others in the economy that are engaged in sensible strategies around regeneration and natural capital. So this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to channel capital into businesses that can support regeneration at scale. As an example, our first investment was into a US company called Mad Capital that are a lending platform, a farm lending platform for farmers that are transitioning to regenerative organic certified acres. Banks are not really good at lending to regeneration. This is a team that's pioneering that space in the US, building the data and making that economic case, that agronomic case for regen. We've also invested in No Fence that have been down there selling their wares. Virtual fencing is a very interesting technology if you're trying to get farmers more engaged and get more out of rotational and managed grazing, AMP grazing, holistic plan grazing. You can graze through your woodland. The Spanish and Portuguese government are considering using No Fence at scale for reducing wildfire risk by grazing through woodlands. Happy to touch on any of that. We've invested in 5 companies so far. We're about to invest in 3 more companies. And hopefully we'll invest in 20 to 30 over the next 4 to 5 years. And this is us. Unfortunately, Julia couldn't be with us. She got COVID, which was a real bummer. Chris is here. Do stand up, Chris. Here are some of those companies that I mentioned. I know it's been a long day, so I'll speed up. We're raising £50 million. If you happen to be a billionaire, come and speak to me. Sorry. And thank you very much for listening. Questions? Please don't be shy.
And I think if there is a lack of immediate questions, I think the big thing here, obviously, we're investors, but how do we create a rising tide, whether you're a producer or a retailer or anyone within the supply chain? We've really got to break out of this wonderful echo chamber that is Groundswell and try and educate and bring more people to the party. And as hopefully Simon's done a great job of showing, the 2 levers that we think are underpulled and often undereducated on are nutrition on the one hand, which has actually been very well talked about, I think, this year at Groundswell, and hydrology and the process of water dynamics to cool our planet. So I suppose our last ask from you guys is to really try and push that as a talking point in whatever field you operate in.
Hi, thanks. I live in Norwich, and we've got 2 really large sort of industrial scale indoor growing places. One cost 25 million, the other cost 45 million. One's the most expensive in the world so far. They make a very strong case for how we need this and how this will supply the essential food for our food system. And it doesn't, of course, respond at all to Walter's thesis. And I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit more to this, because that seems to be, that's the kind of place that venture capital money generally goes. If
I come in quickly, and then I'm going to pass over to Simon. I mean, this is a perennial argument. The basic fundamentals are we evolved to need a nutrient profiling of a certain standard, you could call it. And if we're just looking nutritionally at vertically farmed food, the media that they are fed at their root stocks, their root stems, would need to be equivalent to healthy soil to have the full spectrum of nutrient profiling that we've evolved to need to thrive, for our bodily processes to work over the course of a day, a season, a year. And at this stage, that is quite simply not possible. So on the consumption nutritional end, it's lacking. It's not to say it isn't a great all-year employer and it can't produce an all-year product and it can't replace a less nutrient-dense alternative, but it's not optimum. It's not where we look. On the restoring our biosphere and our systems, I mean, you obviously understand the inherent issue.
Is that working? Yeah, we're very good as humans at creating technology that addresses immediate needs, and then we tend to convince ourselves that it's incredibly wonderful and brilliant, and kind of oversell it. There's an awful lot of that going on in our space. I'm sure Chris and I will make some stupid mistakes. We are human beings, but we're trying. I mean, our modus operandi is to try and avoid some of those pitfalls, and to invest in the entrepreneurs who are part of this community, have alighted on it, have gone deep into their own particular areas of specialism, and are developing technology that is appropriate for regeneration. So yes, I mean, technology is a tool. You know, I can use an axe to chop up a bit of firewood and build a fire and literally save my family from freezing to death on a cold night in a forest, or I can get really angry and bury it in someone's head because I got pissed off. So technology is essentially benign. We're very good at using technology to degenerate. Not just degenerate our landscapes, but also almost degenerate ourselves in the process, right? We're trying to raise the bar a little bit and look towards technology that is geared towards regeneration.
Within that, one of the other elements that is not always stacked on our side is in the world of venture investing, which is considered the riskiest asset class. Venture investors are often looking for a nice, quick, clean story that they can get their head around. And perhaps this industry sometimes suffers from a narrative that isn't as sexy as other industries competing for investor attention. And I think the storytelling element is something that every part of this piece would benefit from. And we look at what Wild Farmed are doing. We look at what Ben McDonald does at Restore to one of his, Ben is a fantastic ecological historian and storyteller, but one of the brilliant pieces that gets people on side initially is his ability to be able to explain what abundant biodiversity would have looked like in 1750 for someone watching the herring run finish its final piece in late spring off the great Yarmouth coastline with humpback whales and gannets and cormorants diving and dolphins and the ocean looking like it was boiling. Meanwhile, a swarm of blue flotillas, I think they're called, but a swarm of butterflies so thick that it took 2 days to pass from France into the UK. And this ability to paint a picture to whichever part of an audience, whether it's an investor or whether it's someone about to pick up a book to learn about what rewilding or regenerating our food systems might look like for the first time, is key. And Tim Benton did it very well. Henry does it very well. Andy Cato can do it very well. But I think it's a really key element for early stage investing to try and get more of the LP community in the UK, which is not as sophisticated and percentage-wise much smaller than it is in the US, for instance, to really understanding the enormous opportunity that we have. So Simon and I have 660 companies in our pipeline that we would deem, broadly speaking, regenerative. It's a word with our I suppose boundaries to it. There's room for multiple investment funds. The return profiles of these companies, we're trying to back companies that are equal to, if not in excess of, their equivalents outside of the regenerative food and farming space, so that we can prove to a broader LP community that as a returns-based asset class alone, this is really worth backing. The urgency and the impact returns piece, if people aren't already on side, has to be dramatically shown to them, which is a process that takes time.
Hi there. My name's Tim Smedley. I'm glad to hear that you like storytellers because I'm a writer. I wrote a book about water called Solving the World's Water Crisis, The Last Drop, and that led me to regenerative agriculture. Basically, all roads lead back to agriculture when it comes to water. I think we're in the Affinity Water area here, are we? So I spoke to a director at Affinity Water for the book. He's been moved on. Who said that he was interested in no-till, and he got his water engineers to crunch the numbers on theoretically what would happen if you turn the whole of Affinity Water's area over to no-till farming, if you somehow persuaded all the farmers to do it. And they came back to me, it's not a published piece of research, but they came back to me with a figure that it would be equivalent to building the second largest reservoir in the country. So it's so capital intensive to build water infrastructure like reservoirs. We've got these huge aquifers beneath our feet that could be filled. So that is very much what you're working on. So well done and keep doing it. The other side of things I wanted to talk to you about, which is a lot less known and less funded, is a lot of my conclusions also led back to things like rewiggling rivers, restoring rivers to a beaver-dominated environment. So you mentioned the 1700s. The last beaver alive in England was in 1789. It was in York. So our river systems should be wider. They should be strewn with beaver dams. That should infiltrate down into our groundwater. It should go through our floodplains. Our floodplains also, if you go back to the 1700s, would have been covered in floodplain meadows, the deepest root systems we have of natural grass systems. Those two things would go a big way to solving our water crisis in England, restoring beavers, restoring floodplains. But I imagine they're not particularly sexy to investors. And they're not particularly sexy to farmers because it means giving over some of your fields to floodplains and beavers. So I wondered, how can you bring capital into those areas and how can we make them a farmer-friendly story?
Can I just quickly give the stat that Peter Bick gave last week? Simon and I, Peter Bick's been doing a fantastic sort of covering of the UK to get his latest film, Roots to Soil. Am I right?
Roots So Deep.
Roots So Deep, to be seen. It's a 4-part docu-series, which I think went live on Netflix on Wednesday. Definitely worth a look, Carbon Cowboys. But one of his farms that had just adopted AMP grazing, adaptive multi-paddock grazing, where you hammer your grass and then you move on for enough time for the roots to be able to really grow to where they would have been in mimicking a predator-prey relationship before they're revisited. But this particular farmer measured the amount of water that was stored that year versus what would have been happening in conventionally grazed farming. And it was 250,000 litres for the hectare, which, as you say, in terms of saving money building a reservoir was really pronounced.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have the. I think this needs to be taught in schools. This needs to be taught. My brother is he works in a parallel field, working with corporates on ESG sustainability. He recently completed a master's at I think it was Oxford. We talk a lot about this stuff, and he thought the Masters was a complete waste of time in the context of understanding this stuff that we all talk about. So, we have an entire professional class that don't understand any of these things, who help make most of the decisions. We went to I forget what the politician's called. He's probably going to be kicked out because he's a Conservative, but we went to a meeting where there was a new DEFRA minister, and the farmers were talking about water and flooding, and I think this was back in maybe February. And he said, yes, we need more flood barriers and we need more flood defences. And I mean, I'm sure he's a very intelligent man in many respects, but in this area, he knew he got the complete wrong end of the stick, to the point where his policies, if he had a chance to enact them, would have been completely counterproductive.
In terms of investment, it's tricky. This is that the answer is there are always enabling technologies, and finding them and making sure they've got models that are going to fit with the venture return is our job. And the reality is we've got companies coming out of our ears, and I think No Fence is a great example. They can't supply demand, and we've met farmers who've said because they can move their fences virtually, have taken their wives out on dates for the first time in a decade. It's completely revolutionized their lives. But as a tool to ultimately increase nutrient density in their herd, to restore hydrological systems, to ultimately get paid for those ecosystem benefits, it's an enormous transformational tool. And I suppose alighting on those is really our job, and what we see as being really our motivation.
Yeah, we'd love to read your book. We hadn't heard of your book, so please come up. Fantastic. Thank you. Please.
I understand the water cycle where the water is evaporated into clouds and the clouds reflect the radiation and so forth. But surely a desert that gets to 70 or 80 or 100 degrees is also radiating huge amounts of energy back into space. Isn't that cooling the planet?
Sorry, could that bare ground is also reflecting
large amounts of heat to the
yes. So what's happening is that heat that re-radiates off the landscape is getting absorbed by excessive amounts of greenhouse gases, including water vapor. So the water vapor itself that is in the atmosphere absorbs the heat. The CO2 and the methane, the nitrous oxide, absorbs the heat, but it gets retained in the atmosphere.
I see.
It's the hydrological systems that are able to essentially jettison the heat, as I understand it, back out into the atmosphere.
So the clouds radiate heat much more effectively than a bare atmosphere.
That's my understanding, yes.
Right, okay, thanks.
Yeah, if we didn't have life on Earth, we'd just be it would be really unpleasant down here, in a nutshell. Please.
We can't hear you, but we'll probably hear you if you shout. Try pressing it.
Hello?
Great.
Doesn't need a microphone. I'm delighted to see this session here. I came across the work of Walter Jehne about 2 years ago, and I've spent quite a lot of time since then talking to many people saying, do you realise we can actually cool the planet? And the answer's not carbon. And they nod and they look so astonished that they just turn away. So I hear your call for other people to get this message going and so on, and whoever is your replacement for Walter as the David Attenborough of this world, you can get this country to turn on a pin, like with the single-use plastics and the turtles in the sea. You can get that kind of stuff to go. But I would encourage everybody in this room to tell 10 people that you can cool the planet through water, put up with the blank looks you got, because one person out of those 10 will take that story on.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, geography's, you know, it's not a sexy subject. Meteorology, it's understudied, underknown. So, you know, who are the charismatic storytellers that can take this mantle up and push it? You know, can we get someone to give Clarkson a lesson on Clarkson's farm, for instance? Genuinely, you know, these are things that we consider. We're setting up Chris Van Pelican as an example at the moment with Jeremy Clarkson and Andy to try and get Jeremy to understand his own health via the food that he's planting. So to try and make that link much more apparent, because frankly, as great as Clarkson's farm has been for awareness, he's not doing as much as he should be doing to move this space. And I'm on this fourth season that will come out next year, I still think he could be doing more. So, you know, who are the charismatic leaders to translate well, and how can we push them?
Hi. Hello. My name's Tom. I'm involved. I run 2 regenerative enterprises. One is making local compost for farm ecosystem restoration, and one is brewing kombucha and botanical drinks for biodiversity. I'm really in a position where I need to organise land regeneration work with people, and my question is about technology. And your investments seem to be quite, you know, in high technology. I don't know if that's a fair statement, but it strikes me that what we really need is a return to low technology, and actually the simplest technology is human beings just being paid to restore ecosystems, you know, just to do the work of making the compost and applying it. And so that's the kind of area we need to invest in, and I don't see how that can be profitable. So my question is, do you do any grants?
The whole, you're absolutely spot on, and just, you know, this technology piece is just a very narrow slither that enables some of the rest. You know, and we wouldn't be as grand to say that we would compare ourselves to the plough or the loom or a computer, but it's a part. In terms of the government working out how to get young people on the land, get return farmers to the land and actually subsidise properly, I mean, this is a hugely complex issue that is being tackled around this festival many times at once. But the answer is, you know, we need to solve the return to the land and how to make that happen crucially. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can. Thinking longer down the track, I think there will be a relationship whereby farmers are properly remunerated for ecosystem services. It's a web of complexity at the moment, and I think there will be. Well, we've just got to all figure it all out as to like how it can work and how it can actually enable genuine small producers, and not just be sort of a purview of those that have large land and lots of capital available.
As a tech example for this, we didn't end up investing because the company actually couldn't quite work out the model, but it was, how do you bring young people onto the land for small scale horticultural missions? And they were looking at half-acre to acre sites. They were looking at finding land, leasing it, supplying seeds, supplying equipment, supplying timings, methodologies, planting regimes, such that in Canada they thought that they could get it to, it was £148,000 a year generated revenue from, I think it was half an acre. One person working on the land. It was you know, the hours were intense, but to get young people back onto the land, the project has to be instantly viable for them. And although this didn't end up working, we could see examples of similar types of company getting close to, and perhaps, you know, these wouldn't be venture investable, but they would be local companies working locally to try and bring people on, and they could easily be subsidized. And we think that the kind of the uptick in access to local food via these kind of initiatives is also very interesting and potentially very quick if it's executed properly and well. And part of the excitement for us is that these kind of things will start kicking off quite aggressively over the next decade, as local and understanding of what nutrient-dense food really begins to look like.
I work for a Rivers Trust. You may have come across us before. people in the audience. We do, all of our work is around water. That's our focus. And most of our organisations across the country have an education officer. We go into schools, we have river education vans. And so my question for them is, where are the resources and the best bits of information that they can add into that? They talk about the holisticness of rewiggling rivers, but I'm not entirely sure if stuff like, as you said, Walter's research is getting into that yet, and it should. So where's the good resources for us? And would you fund them if they aren't there?
Well,
not us, as in making the resource.
We know people who could potentially fund it. We can't fund it ourselves at the moment. But let's talk about that. Let's give it. There might be some things information online that I can point you in the direction of. Yeah. Okay.
Over here, lady in the white.
Testing.
So I'm really interested in this because my partner is a farmer, but I work in legal tech in VC-backed startups. So I'm used to having the conversation from the other side, where we're delivering on requests, if you will, to continue funding into, Series A, Series B, and eventually onto equity event. One of the big risks that I would see looking at regenerative agriculture, looking at climate solutions from a farming point of view, is that many of the schemes that promise to reward farmers for the work that they do are time limited. Farmers are locked out of achieving any kind of economic viability from the work that they're doing. Just to give you an example, we're over from Ireland. The National Biomethane Strategy was held last week. The venue was in Dublin, which probably 85% of farmers couldn't get to. It was held on the 12th of June, a date you can almost guarantee that every farmer in the country will be on a tractor, and it was priced at €330 a ticket. So back in March, I called them out on this, and I said, you clearly don't want farmers there or being involved in the structure of what we plan for biomethane. And they was like, no, they'll be there. What came out of it is farmers will provide the feedstock to these biomethane companies for free. So in a lot of cases, what's happening is that corporate interests are moving in. They're the ones making the profit. Farmers are the one doing the work and taking the blame. I see this as a huge risk for VCs in this space. So have you thought about, and what could we do to ensure income streams for the companies, the individuals that you are funding?
Excellent question. So first of all, the challenge that we've set for ourselves in terms of how we manage our firm and how we due diligence companies, how we assess them, how we work out whether we're comfortable to invest in them or not, includes these lines of questioning. So that's the first thing. So if we end up doing the opposite of what you're advocating for, then, come and punch me in the face when I do it. I think there's an issue so carbon at the moment and biodiversity, in a sense, there's a risk that these are just becoming commodities. And I've been reading some things recently, talking to people in that narrow space. So the startups that are involved in baselining, monitoring, reporting, and verification, project management on the ground, and then the aggregation and trading of these to buyers. And I think that a more elegant solution would be essentially subscription models. So going back to the fact that ecosystem services are services, to your point, they happen over a long period of time, and someone's doing the work. There will be good years and bad years. There's flux. There's things that happen that you can't account for, like a wildfire or farmer drops dead or like whatever. There's things that are going to happen that are unpredictable, that do not lend themselves to essentially a commodity trade. These should be long-term. Yeah. And at the moment, the policy is conceived around this idea of literally a chunk of something that's being sold, and then that's it. So no, I agree with you. So the challenge for us is to try and, I think there's a very good rationale behind backing startups that are not going down that path, but have got a different business model. And so we'll be looking into that.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.